Hi, this is the third option, and we are Rick
Judy.
and we're so glad that you're watching or listening. And we hope this is a blessing to you today as we continue speaking on the book of Romans. And what we're doing in these episodes that we're in the middle of right now is going through the book of Romans, but rather than taking forever to go through a verse by verse, we're highlighting some of the more key chapters that speak of more important or more defined theological issues and conundrums that comes up. And Paul certainly deals with that in the book of Romans, right?
Yeah. So previous to this, we've gone over Romans 1 and 2, and we went over Romans 5. And so today we're going to look at Romans 6,
Roman-
keeping in mind that this was a letter written, not divided into chapters at that time, but later, just for ease of reference, was
That's how we do the Bible. We divide it up
considered
into verses.
chapters and verses. So, first off, let's talk about who this audience is that Paul is writing to. He did not begin a church work in Rome, but he's writing to a group of Jewish and Gentile Christians who have gotten together in Rome as a church. And he's writing really to, I think, unify them
Hmm.
and kind of
Yeah,
help discern what the most important things are here.
yeah.
And so these Jewish believers, they knew the law of Moses. That was so key and important to them. They knew covenant theology, they knew Jewish identity. These things were kind of in them from birth. And so it was very difficult for them to kind of let go of
Hmm.
that. These Gentile Christians coming in, they were steeped in like worship that was like idol worship, emperor worship, sexual immorality. These things were, they were more unfamiliar with the morality that the Jewish believers had. So there was this tension between the two groups. Before, the Jewish people would kind of separate themselves from Gentiles, and Gentiles were not that interested in the Jewish. So to put them all together caused a lot of friction and
Yeah.
a lot of issues. And I think Paul is trying to kind of bring these two groups, this tension between the two groups together.
He's bringing them together, and he's also addressing the concerns of each one. One was more concerned with the law, the morality, the behavior, and the others have come really because of this gospel of Christ, which speaks grace. And so he addresses those, and I think that's why Romans, it's such an exhaustive letter. It covers so much. So it's a real, what would you call it? Or it's a good thesis of Christian living, really,
Mhm.
and Christian, I guess you could say, theology.
If Paul had been studying for his doctorate, this would be his dissertation,
Right, right,
right?
right, right,
So he's kind of putting together what Jesus has shown him to feed these
right. And he goes to great
believers.
pains to explain the gospel of God's grace through Jesus Christ and how it relates to behavior and morality too.
And if you think about it, if we're in 57, 58 AD, this Christianity had only been around for like 20 years.
Mm.
They were really trying to figure it out, I think,
Right.
a lot of ways.
Right. And so, thank God for this man that did a lot in forwarding the cause. But it does relate to us today because today we find there is still a conundrum about this grace and behavior issue. And this,
Mm,
what we're getting into today, I think really addresses it very,
it
very
does.
strong. Yeah.
So if we look at what built up to Romans 6, kind of some of the stuff that we've already gone over is in Romans 1 through 5, Paul has set up his theological argument that all have sinned, and let's say all have missed the mark, all have missed their calling. All of humanity has. Nobody can earn righteousness, not through the law, not through your own willpower. Salvation, and if we think about that word meaning healing, wholeness,
Deliverance,
deliverance,
preservation.
preservation, that can only come through Jesus Christ, according to Paul. And God's grace is greater than sin. So these are the things that Paul has set up to this point. But in Romans 5, he makes a statement that can be easily understood
And it still is today.
and still is today. So he says, where sin increased, grace abounded all the more.
Right. And
But
that's sort of how he finished the chapter 5.
yeah, and I think that lends to the question of, okay, well, if that's true, why don't we just sin as much as we want to, because then grace will abound more. And this is how he
And
begins
this is where we get into chapter
Romans
6.
6.
So it's really good because that's a question or an issue that you still run into a lot today when you
Mention
talk.
grace.
Maybe if someone thinks maybe you're talking too much about grace or overemphasizing the grace or
Yeah.
the love of God, people today will ask the same question that's presented at the beginning of Romans 6, because the preceding statement was, like you said, where sin abounds, grace much more abounds. So then the question is, so what are you saying? People today say, "What are you saying? That that it's okay to just keep on sinning?" You hear that a lot.
Like sin is not important
Like
now.
sin or behavior is not important. So he addresses that in the first verse of the chapter, and he says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin so that grace may abound?" And then he says, "God forbid," or "Certainly not."
In
And
the Greek, that is a very
yeah.
strong, absolutely not. Like
Mhm.
it's strong.
Yeah. So he says, "How can we? How shall we who are dead to sin live any longer in it?" So now what we're getting into is it breaks the assumption that people have. But even today, when people go there about grace and saying, "Well, should we just sin so that grace can abound? Or is behavior in sin not important?" If you overemphasize grace, people say, "Well, then people will just think it's okay to sin." And what they neglect is the power of knowing Christ in you, the power of letting the grace of God work in us. The grace of God gets us into a closeness with God, gets us into a trust with a wonderful Father, gets us into where we really start to know and feel this God of love, and we learn his character and his ways. Like Titus says, the grace of God teaches us godliness. It's the spirit in us that teaches us these things. And so what he says is, you're dead to that thing that didn't work, that
Mm.
dead to sin or missing the mark. You're dead to and he really in this he addresses both sides in this, because he's addressing a system that didn't effectively deal with sin. The law was so much about morality and a code, a very strict code, trying to bind people from committing sin, and it doesn't work. And Paul talks about that too and explains why it doesn't work. But it also deals with the indulgence of the lawless Gentiles who were doing the things that you had mentioned. And for them, it's a fix because it changes us from the inside out, and the power of and any of us that really know God and know uh, have been affected by a knowledge of God that we didn't have, and have been affected by falling in love with a wonderful God who is teaching us his ways. We know the power of that change, and we love that, and we embrace it. And the reason is because to an old mindset or an old belief that we had. And he talks about being slaves of sin. Well, to be a slave of sin means you think you can't help it. You think
Mhm.
that's just how I am or who I am. And so even today we have people, vowing to God they're not going to do something again, or trying so many different things to try to not sin. And so they live in that realm where they feel like I just can't help it. I'm in
Mhm.
that I'm a slave to sin. And he says, rather than that, look to this new life, look to this new and living way where the
Mhm.
power of God is unto wholeness, and reckon yourself instead of a slave of sin as a slave of righteousness. You can't help but have the changes continue to happen in your life, because greater is he that's in you than he that's in the
Mhm.
world.
I think it's really interesting that Paul uses this illustration of slavery, being a slave to sin, because slavery was a very common part of the Roman culture. And so to be a slave to someone, it's like you can't help it. You're stuck. You're enslaved. And so he's comparing being enslaved to like a master who is harsh and you can never please them, to a slave of righteousness, which is you're not even trying, but all of this goodness is is beginning to come out of you.
Yeah.
So it's your source that's different.
Yeah. And another thing too is the key is that we have the life in us that's doing this work in us. And it's a progressive work. It's
Mhm.
not an all or nothing. And I think a lot of times people are looking for an all or nothing fix. And they think if we can impose a moral code and say, just don't do these things, then that's sort of the instant fix to stop someone from sinning.
Mhm.
But then somebody invariably does. And then what do? Then we either judge and condemn, or, we go to work at some kind of restoration or whatever. We're trying to keep somebody from sinning that has a sin consciousness, because when you impose a moral code and you say do not do something, this is why Paul says it stirs up the passion of sin, because you can't help it. Scientifically, they've proven our brain does not know how to not do something. For instance, if you're on the golf course and you tell yourself don't hit the ball in the water, your brain doesn't know how to not hit a ball in water. It knows how to hit a ball in water, and it might know how to hit a ball straight if you've trained it a little bit. But to tell it not to do something, it doesn't know how to do that.
Mhm.
They use so many examples. Race car drivers know if you look at the wall at the turn, you're more likely to hit it. If you look at a full cup of coffee and you're carrying it across the living room while you're watching it, and
Mhm.
you're saying don't spill it, you're more likely to spill
Mhm.
it. And so we're not made to not do something. It's what moral code does.
So are you telling me that the reason why I don't commit adultery is because it's not because I read the 10 commandments and I decided in my own
Mhm.
strength, I'm just never going to commit adultery?
Do you wake up every day and say, Judy, do not commit adultery today?
No, I don't even think about it. But it's funny because I think a lot of people think that those 10 commandments have the power to keep people from doing things that there's other reasons why they're doing it.
There is something within us,
Yeah.
and it gets released with the graciousness of God, that's where we have this awareness of this union with Him, where it's working in us. Honestly, I've never murdered anyone. But the reason I've not murdered someone is not because I have to go back to Exodus 20 and find the verse and repeat it to myself, thou shalt not kill. Even if I never read that, wouldn't I dare say I would never kill someone, because there's a law that really works in me,
Mhm.
that when you're aware of that, or you tap into that, it has a power to bring about godliness in you.
Right.
And so this is what Paul is directing it to. He's directing people's attention to true godliness that works as a law within them. And it's a
Mhm.
law of life, and it's a law of liberty. And
Mhm.
and so he reiterates that it's the power of God that brings this about in our lives. And it goes to, so that's why he talks so much about faith in him and trust in him, because it's about that. And when we try to diminish grace and try to and say that we still need this mixture of things that Paul sure didn't like, it's because we're neglecting the power of Christ in us.
Mhm.
And we want to take on some of our willpower to help that. And so we want to go back into that which doesn't work. And Paul says, you're dead to that whole old thing, dead to the old willpower system, that just trying to live by moral code, and outwardly imposed moral code upon you. There's an inward life that's in you, and
Mhm.
it's teaching us righteousness, peace, and joy in the Spirit.
Mhm.
And so, and of course, later on, he talks about it's really the nature of God. For love takes care of all of that. If
Mhm.
love is happening inside me, then I don't commit adultery. I don't murder. I don't steal. I don't want to do
I don't
those
want to say
things
bad things about other
because of
people.
love. The
Yeah.
reason that you don't commit adultery is because you really like me a lot. You got something inside
I
you,
do.
you know, and um, and that's how that works. And this gets really good if people, even more of us as Christians today, can rejoice in the power that works in us and let it do its thing. Let it be progressive. It's
Mhm.
not an instant fix for everything, but
Mhm.
it is an establishing of God, establishing his ways. It's in our heart, but it's in our minds where he's
Mhm.
establishing. And it's beautiful to learn these glorious ways of God, and they're always in line with the ways of love. And that fulfills and takes care of everything. And man, when Christians learn, when Christianity as a whole learns to trust that and live by that, I'll tell you what, the world will be so attracted to this Jesus, and changes will happen in human hearts. And we don't have to keep fighting over and trying to impose morality on people. Hearts will be changed by the goodness of God that's working in them.
I think one thing that Romans 6 I've seen in my life is in that 12-step program. I've been involved in that for many years ago. And Dr. Bob and Bill W., who were the founders of, 12 steps, is for anything that you feel addicted to, you can't stop, you can't control. And that first step is that we found ourselves powerless over whatever the behavior was. So that means my flesh, in my best attempting a moral code or even, trying to control my own flesh, I'm powerless over it. But then in the second step, you come to understand a God that is greater than you. And I think a lot of people had a distorted version of religion during that time. And that's why Dr. Bob and Bill just made it a power greater than yourself. You simply start there and it will lead you where it needs to
Yeah.
lead you. But you need a power greater than yourself. So you're taking all your reliance off yourself. I have failed at this. I am powerless, but there is a God, and I'm going to just turn my will and my life over to this power that's greater than me. And I'm going to trust in that. And you know how many people have come out of very serious, debilitating, life altering addictions because of this, coming to the end of
Yeah.
your thing. And I know
Mm.
sometimes it's scary because, especially if you've been raised in religion or even the Jewish Christians.
Mhm.
I mean, it's so hard. I have such compassion for them saying, really? Like, I'm going to let go of all these, washings and food and, laws, these 613 laws. You want me to just like let that
Mhm.
go? It's very disturbing, I would say, like very different. And I don't think it would be an easy thing to
So
give to.
right, and correct me if I'm wrong, was what the founders of the 12-step ideas did happen to be a Christian, but
Yes.
wanted to use terminology that everyone could come into and relate to, because of what's sad is because so much of the ideas of Christianity are so still so much about our own abilities and willpower that he had to speak in terms where it's like, no, you don't have the power yourself. You need help from the higher power, the one, your source, your father, your creator, whatever you call him, God. You can contact God
Mhm.
who's in you. And that brings me to something else here in Romans 6, where he says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, because you're not under the law, but under grace. So he makes that statement. So that's saying something about the law. Like, you're saying that the reason sin had dominion on us was because of that whole law stuff and so on. But he's
Yeah.
also saying, because you're under grace, that's why sin won't have dominion. And then here's how that works. He says, what then? People say, what shall we sin because we're not under law, but under grace? Certainly not. Don't you know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves, whether it's of sin that leads to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed the doctrine from which you were delivered. You believed the message. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. Now, what he's saying in this language here is that, for instance, now he speaks to both groups, I think, here. He's saying, now, under the law there, he says, what's so bad about that? He said, are you saying just sin because we're not under the law? He says, no, because under that, you were presenting yourselves as slaves of sin. It was all about sin consciousness. Don't sin, don't sin. Here's the things that you're not allowed to do. And they were really into that. And when you read the law in the Old Testament, it's really not just a whole bunch of do nots. There also are a lot of do's, like take care of the poor, take care of the widow, visit, do these good things also. And when Jesus showed up, it seems like they were neglecting those things, right?
Mhm.
Not visiting the orphans and the widows, not providing for certain ones, not, and visiting the prisoner. but they were certainly into the do nots. And
Mhm.
and it was really harsh. So they were all about the sin thing. It was all about trying to overcome this sin. And
Mhm.
so he says, so you're presenting yourselves as if we're slaves of sin and we're trying to corral that. So this whole other thing says, in the same way that you thought sin had such a pull on you and was continually working on you like that, so you had to try to corral it with a moral code, in the same way, look at this righteousness, how it has
Mhm.
a power and it always is having a pull on you and it's always drawing you. And the same way that people struggled not to sin, it's almost a struggle to not grow in righteousness. And I mean that because I'll say this, when God has showed me more of his heart and his character, it is too gracious. So it has been too gracious for my mind to want to embrace, where it's like, that's too much, God. That's too inclusive. It's too merciful. And my own mind thinks of these questions. I think most
Mhm.
of ours had. My mind is like, yeah, but what about sin? you know,
Mhm.
and so I've had pushback against the character of God that continues to exert its beautiful and gentle force in my heart.
Okay.
But as time has gone, I've given into it. Just like people can try to resist sin by
Mhm.
being sin conscious, but eventually they can often give into it. It's the same way with righteousness, because
Mm.
when you're righteousness conscious, that righteousness is working. And that's how we grow as a Christian.
Mhm.
And I've often said, I've grown into so much more love, grace, mercy, empathy, understanding of people, gaining in the heart of God in such a way that it just touches me so. But I've gone kicking and screaming. There's been
Yeah,
resistance
in
to it
some instances, yeah.
because God's righteousness has actually gone against my Christian doctrine because I was too focused on morality codes and behavior. And I'd be like, yeah, but what about sin?
Well, and also to think we've been trained that way. I mean, that's
Right.
kind of the revelation that we were given growing up. And so it's not a simple thing to let that go.
Hmm.
So I like that you're pointing that out, that there's a lot of times a little bit of a resistance, like, wait a minute,
Hmm.
this is
Yeah.
going too far. But then you're like, but why? If love is helping me and helping me experience more peace and more grace towards others, that feels like a good thing
Yeah,
and not a
it's the
scary thing.
love of
Yeah.
God that so loved the world. And then he goes on, but God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart the doctrine that was delivered to you of righteousness. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. And this is what I was just trying to describe, was that this righteousness is bigger than me and you. And it continues to pull us into his ways, whereas people are so concerned about sin, always pulling you into something horrible. Apparently, from what Paul says, that's the way that it strengthens that. He says
Hmm.
it stirs up the passions of sin. He says,
Hmm.
and the law is the strength of it, strengthens
Hmm.
that sin, because your mindset is that of 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 sin having this kind of dominion and strength over mankind, and all we have is morality to try to hold them,
Control it. Yeah.
try to control that, and that's neglecting this beautiful kingdom of heaven that's in us, that brings about righteousness and peace and joy in the spirit,
It's like
brings
a
about the fullness of God
inside, from the inside out.
from the inside out.
Jesus would mention about the Pharisees having this whitewashed outer, like he called
Mhm.
them tombs, because they were whitewashed on the outside. They looked good, they presented well, they were well respected. But on the inside, they were empty, they were dead because they were all relying on the outer manifestation and they weren't allowing for an inner life to
Yeah.
happen.
And there are untold multitudes of people that have stories of, "I had these addictions and I couldn't quit," or "I had this behavior or this lifestyle," or whatever, and they have been changed from the inside. Fruit has happened
Mm.
because of trusting God. And that's why we can look more to the grace of God that has fruit unto righteousness. And the more you grow in this, you're going to find yourself letting some of these things drop off that want to take distract you and pull you back into looking at moralism and behavior and all that.
Mhm.
And someone might say, "Are you saying morality is bad?" No, I'm saying that what we call morality is actually produced
Mm.
by the heart of God in us. And Paul ends the letter by saying this. He says, "But now look," he says, "having been set free from sin," and let's say, let's take the Gentiles that have lived indulgent before this that he's talking to. He says, "But now look at you." He says, "Having been set free from sin, you have become slaves of God, and you have fruit unto holiness," or we could say, God likeness. And he says, and in the end, it's everlasting life. Jesus said it would spring up unto everlasting life.
Mhm.
He was doing the same thing. He would say, "It will be something in you.
Mhm.
It'll be something in you springing up." And another thing we see in Paul's writings, Romans all the way through, is he's talked so much about the Spirit, the Spirit, the Spirit. People weren't talking about the Spirit until Jesus came along and brought about this reality of
Mhm.
a river of living water flowing from within us.
Mhm.
He's telling a man named Nicodemus things of the Spirit. He's like, "How can any of this be?" He says, "You're a teacher in Israel and you don't know about these things?" He says, "If I tell you spiritual things," he says, "how are you going to understand?"
But that's why he said, all have sinned, all have missed the
Yeah.
mark, all have missed their true calling. These religious leaders and teachers didn't know their true calling, that was what Jesus was presenting. You mentioned that there were some key words in this chapter,
Yeah.
in chapter 6.
Yeah.
Am I jumping ahead of
No, it's
you?
right here. And it,
So,
it's in here in chapter 6 because he says, "You've died to sin
uh,
and you've been raised with Christ."
right.
And so he'll use terms and he'll say like knowing and reckoning. So we're talking a mindset here. We're talking about having an awareness of something. And
Mhm.
he says things like, "For you have died," he said, "so knowing that he who dies to sin is no longer bound by that, knowing that." And then
Yeah,
he says things like, "So therefore reckon yourself to be dead to that and alive to God."
yeah.
I mean, that's resurrection there.
Mhm.
Reckon yourself to have been raised in this new life, because it is a new life. It is much different from trying to restrict and deny
Mhm.
yourself from doing something bad. And it's a little bit very sad actually to me that we still have a lot of that mixture in Christianity to where they still feel like they have that the way to live a Christian life is to impose a moral code and not let up on it. And every once in a while pay homage to grace and use that word, but basically impose that moral code. And when someone like me sometimes comes along talking about grace very strongly, they do get nervous sometimes
Mhm.
because they're like, people are going to throw away the moral code and just go with grace, and they think, and grace is just going to make them feel like they can just sin because they think that they're slaves to sin. They
Mhm.
think that these people are a bunch of slaves to sin, and if you remove the restriction of a moral code from them, then they're just going to all give in to their master. And they're
Kinda,
not their master is not sin.
yeah, well, which kind of reveals that they haven't experienced that
Right.
life in them,
Right.
because they wouldn't be so afraid
Right.
if they haven't. But you have to kind of step off the cliff
Mhm.
to find out that the
Yeah.
grace, gracious living, the grace of God in you actually does have power. It
Yeah.
does actually make changes within you.
And what's happening in people like that is that grace you find out later on. That grace is working and is trying, it's speaking to them, but there can be some resistance. Like I said, I did it a lot. And so because we didn't understand, most of us, and if you're very exposed to fundamentalist or evangelical Christianity, which is my roots, we were taught that. We were taught basically that we're slaves to sin, but try not to do it. And we need that moral code because if you lift the moral code, our master
Mhm.
will just suck us up and cause us to sin. But if you reckon yourself dead to that and alive to God, that there's a master that's stronger than that is not our master. We have a master that speaks to us, that we're in tune and in touch with now, trusting in him, faith in him, then we're more apt to hear that. And he says, and we become a slave of that. We keep following that.
Mhm.
Not that we do everything right. We can still commit what would be classified as sin, but more and more over time, we find ourselves being pulled into the gravity of God's heart,
Mm,
where we continue to grow. We continue to learn more and
mhm.
more. And it's beautiful to watch it happen to ourselves and to
Right.
others.
So when you talk about the mindset of knowing, of reckoning, this is something that I guess that you've heard the saying, the foolishness of preaching, or
Hmm.
that you're preaching to remind ourselves, to remind each other that we're living out of a new system and not the old system. And that's helps us kind of continue along this path when it can be hard. There can be internal resistance. There can be persecution. There can be people who are saying or throwing away the relationship because you're, seeing some things about God that threatens them. So I think that beautiful being reminded of what's true about us helps us to really know and reckon ourselves over and over in our life where we're living in this other system, this the knowledge of good and evil kind of worldview.
It's yeah, it's all around us, but God gives us another one. And Paul, he says at the beginning of Romans, he said, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it is the power unto soteria, or wholeness, salvation." So,
And that's
l-
go ahead.
like you said, so he said, so God has chose the foolishness of preaching to bring soteria to us. And what that is, remember, it's the preaching of the good news. It's not just any old kind of preaching. It's the preaching that he did, that he was
Uh-huh.
talking about and was so adamant about.
It was such a big deal for him to say that because he was the muckety muck of the muckety muck. He was like the highest of the Pharisee. He had done the law to the nth degree. And now he's saying, I'm not ashamed of this gospel because it is the true power
It
to live a godly life or
it
live
made
a
him
healthy
so
life.
different. It made him live so much differently than he did before, and not only different from how he once lived, but it made him really different from most everybody else, including a lot of Christian teachers of the
Mhm.
day, because Paul was so adamant. He was crazy about the grace of God, more so than most of us would even dare to be yet.
Mhm.
But he was. If you when we're going to get most of our revelation as God is causing us to grow, and we're finding out how that he's much better than we thought he was and much more gracious than we thought he was. It's like, wow, this is blowing my mind. God, I believe that in my heart, but can you help me make it legal in the Bible? Can I see a scripture? You'll find it usually in Paul's writings,
Yeah. He's
because he was crazy.
Yeah, he's really teaching us to trust that life inside of us, to do the work that it's designed to do. And sometimes that goes against, in our minds, what we think we should be doing or what we think God should be doing in us. But there's this life living in us, and for us to really allow ourselves to trust it.
God loves us all, and God is here to empower us all to life. And we find that in his character, in his love, his grace, his mercy. And that's where we fall in love. That's where we experience intimacy. That's where we know what it is to be in union with him who is life,
Mm,
and you become more like how we see Paul being like, he has totally embraced this. He says, those things that once were important, they're nothing compared to this excellency of knowing
mm,
Jesus Christ, my Lord.
mhm. Yeah,
And so that's the power he's talking
yeah.
about.
I feel like I'm growing in this,
Yeah, me too.
even myself.
I
So
love it.
I hope this has been an encouragement to you. This kind of overview of Romans 6, some of the background, some of these different perspectives that Paul was bringing to a mixed church. And we're going to move forward from this. Next week, we're going to talk about Romans 7 and 8. So I hope you stay with us and share this podcast with someone you think it might encourage. Let us know what you think. And have a great
Have a
day.